Hello everyone, and thanks again for joining us at the 2023 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference on the second day. My name is Michael Christian, and I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan. It is my pleasure to introduce the workshop Introduction to Modern Football Analytics Using Play-by-Play Data, presented by SumerSports. Please join me in welcoming our speakers, Eric Eager, VP of Research and Development, and Sean Clement, Principal Football Analytics Consultant. Enjoy the workshop.
Nice to meet everybody here. I'm Sean Clement and this is Eric Eager. So we're going to talk to you a little bit about some of the history of modern football analytics, going all the way back to the man, the myth, legend, Virgil Carter, and the invention of expected points added, metrics that have been built off of that framework, some limitations, correcting for those limitations, and model assumptions more broadly for football analytics. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Eric, and he can tell you a bit about our favorite Cincinnati Bengal.
Yeah, for sure. So go ahead and move forward here. This is, in a lot of ways, it's really funny because football analytics has had such a growth over the last, half a decade really, and it's there's a lot that we've accomplished, and it's come at the heels of many decades of relatively stagnant growth in the industry. But you go back, 1970, this paper here, Operations Research on Football by Virgil Carter, literally the only research paper I've ever read where the affiliation was an NFL team, and it's the genesis of trying to take the currency that's in this game we love and translate it into something that's more mathematical, more continuous, stuff like that, right? So for anybody, I'm assuming most people in here, know what football is, denominated in, right? But you basically have downs and distances, right? So first down and 10, it's the first of 4 downs you get. You have to gain 10 yards or a touchdown to keep the football. Those yards have been the currency for offensive players forever. So when you talk about Dan Marino, Dolphins in 1984, set the record for passing yards. That was the record for a long, long time. He also set the record for touchdowns at the time with, I believe it was 48. And those are the two currencies that we have. And of course, that is not necessarily a efficient or even like telling the truth necessarily of how well a player performed. Take two running backs, right? Warwick Dunn and Mike Allstott. You have Warwick Dunn runs 70 yards down the sideline, gets pushed out of bounds at the 1 yard line. Mike Allstott gets the 1 yard touchdown. We give the 6 points in the touchdown to Allstott. We give the 70 yards to Dunn. We don't really, that's kind of an incomplete idea of what the contribution is of those two players. So initially here, and then it was by this book that actually just came out in second edition, The Hidden Game of Football, is when we really started to sort of take these things and basically put them on a continuum in a way in terms of expected points. So if we go to the next one, there's been basically a democratization of this idea in the public space, which has been wonderful. I was previously at Pro Football Focus, a private company. Sean worked for the Dolphins and the Ravens. We found even in our own work, kind of being behind paywalls and behind the walls of NFL teams, that this has really increased even our own work, because we get to go, and because of NFL Scrape Bar, which was Max Horowitz, Ron Yurko, and Sam Ventura, their app, we were able to see people like literally, diagnosing things in the NFL on a play-by-play level on blogs and Twitter and stuff like that. Those became our colleagues eventually, which was great. Ben Baldwin, Sebastian Carl, they created NFL FastStar, which was just a sort of faster version of this with additional models, things like expected pass percentage and all of those. And then college football Scrape Bar, which was maintained by a few people, one of our own, Parker Fleming at Sumer.
Sports Dataverse.
And the Sports Dataverse folks as well. So that's just really cool. And it's built up, this idea of an expected point, which if we go to the next slide, like what is EPA? EPA is basically taking that 70 yards that we talked about with Warwick Dunn and assigning a point point number to that, right? A point estimate to that. And because until then, we just gave all 6 of those points to Mike Allstott for running the ball in from the 1-yard line. And while not every yard is equal, it's actually harder to gain 1 yard when it's 1 yard away from the end zone than it is in the middle of the field. It's not 6 points more valuable than the first 70 yards. So, what we have here in the, and every expected points model is about the same, but it's basically the seconds remaining in the half, what yard line you're at, whether the possession team is at home, because home field advantage still does exist, although it's smaller than it used to be, what kind of stadium there is, down in distance, and then which era and how many timeouts remaining for each team. Now, you can sort of pick apart these modeling assumptions. I think, for example, 2020 is one where you probably have to go back and rethink, just because we didn't have fans in the stands and things like that during the COVID years, and there are also issues about basically, like, there are some things that some teams do that bias this expectation, but it's fairly solid set of assumptions here. And what you're trying to predict on is a discrete set of values, right? So football, the points, as we discussed, are not scored on a continuum, right? They're scored in a set of touchdown being 7 points, a field goal being 3, a safety being 2. You have no score, you have a -2, -3, -7 if the other team is the next team to score. And so instead of building like a linear regression, and by the way, these are taken from Ron Yurko's paper, one of the original creators of this, instead of doing a linear regression, which is kind of a disaster, you basically predict the likelihood, probability that any of these, 7 outcomes happen on the next scoring play, and then you sort of take the average over that probability distribution to get expected points.
So,
yeah, go ahead.
So once we have expected points, we can start doing some analysis on the team level and on the play type level. So some of the research from Pro Football Focus from back when Eric was there was, for these different play types, what's the impact that it has on an offensive team? No pressure has an average value of expected points. So if you don't generate pressure, you tend to allow more points, especially in the passing game. All pass plays, that factors in a little bit of pressure, only hurried, only hurt. And then we can see, once you get pressure on the quarterback, the difference between no pressure and all pressure is almost a half of a point. And so that becomes something substantial when you start looking at, let's say, roster building. Because a lot of teams will chase sacks because it's the big number. But if you can consistently generate pressure, I can take away a half a point per play. And that's a huge benefit. But that type of analysis didn't exist 10 years ago. When Ben and I started working within football, I was just somebody on Twitter in 2018, and thankfully the NFL Scraper at the time, and followed on by NFL FastStar packages, existed, and it really did democratize this type of analysis. So now you have not only blogs, but fans of specific teams doing analytical breakdowns of those teams, looking for trends, looking for strengths for their own team, looking for weaknesses of opponents in ways that was absolutely not possible 10 or 20 years ago. And that democratization of data has really allowed this cottage industry of sports analysts to exist. We see people writing for The Athletic using EPA in their articles. We see teams using it for their internal evaluations. We see it as the target variable for tracking data metrics in the big data bowl now, where people are looking at for a specific coverage or all of these moving pieces on the play, what are the EPA implications? It also allows us to start looking at things like coaching. So, when we have expected points, the next step is that we build it into win probability, because expected points is effectively an input to most of the win probability models. For those of you who are not familiar with win probability within play-by-play data of the NFL, it's effectively expected points with game context. So the amount of time remaining in the game or within the half, score differential, and then the NFL FastStar models also incorporate Vegas betting lines. So that gives us an idea of relative team strength at the beginning of the game. So for those of you who think about these things in kind of a Bayesian kind of way, that's our prior for how strong these teams are against each other. So not every game starts as a 50-50 split, even on the first play of the game. And I think that's a fairly intuitive result that we would all think about.
Yeah, and being able to sort of, again, to smoothing out the game, right? So we all think about the decisions that give rise to the touchdowns and the turnovers and that kind of thing. But like, what is the value of a timeout? What is the value of going for a fourth down? All of these things are only possible if we're able to take with the play-by-play data, useful information, quantify it, and then build expectations off of it. So, we at SumerSports, we are, SumerSports.com is our new website as of Tuesday this week. Produced an in-game coaching model, which basically says not only how much probability do your decisions add to your team, but also how much do they add over what you would expect from the league averages. So, remember the Super Bowl, the Eagles punted on 4th and 3 from their own 30 or so. And, everybody said, well, that was a poor in-game decision because of our, Ben Baldwin's model and other models and things like that. But the fact is like no coach really goes for that. So was it a bad decision? Maybe, but was it a bad decision over what you would expect from another coach? No. And when you look at Sirianni's decisions over the course of a season, I think we all look at him and say, hey, this is a coach that actually does add a ton of value to his team. Being able to take that data, break it down into something like win probability, into expected points, and then be able to add up how much more they generate over the average coach, that is the triumph of play-by-play data and some of the analyses that have been done over the past, well, if you go back to Virgil Carter, 50 years, but if you go back, even the last 10 or so in the public realm.
And what's interesting to watch is the amount of pressure that public perception puts on coaching staffs to adapt. And that's something we've really only seen the last 5 years. Previously to this, let's say, era, there wasn't a cost necessarily to not going forward on fourth down or to wasting your timeouts. But now the general public can quantify exactly how much win probability has been wasted through decision making, and it provides a feedback mechanism to coaches. And so you start seeing articles being written or questions within pressers being asked of coaches, and so we see the aggressiveness of NFL coaches and college coaches increasing year over year over year, and that's a very interesting trend to watch, both as a fan from the outside, but also within the building, because those public pressures do have impacts within organizations.
To that point, in 2016, 0 NFL teams went for fourth downs when they were supposed to, more than 50% of the time, and as recent as 2021, that number, more than half of the teams in the NFL do, right? So when you think about, again, everybody is sort of, they like to talk out of both sides of the mouth, even like when, the best coach of all time, Bill Belichick, likes to deride analytics, right? And it's kind of funny, but these teams, like, this is something where information has helped the game evolve. And what's wonderful about that is that once the game evolves, then we sort of think about what happens after that, right? So, the Eagles become a team that goes for a lot of fourth downs. The Lions become a team that go for a lot of fourth downs. They also then become a team that runs the ball more on third and medium because they're trying to set up better fourth downs. And so you get more, a 3rd and 7 was a traditional passing down, and it still will be for a long time. But if you're playing defense against a team like Philadelphia, if it's 3rd and 7, it's really effectively 2nd and 7 for your defense because you have to make 2 stops, and it opens up some of the data problems, right? So it makes some of your assumptions about what a passing down is different because they're changing the game, and that opens up new questions. The solutions that we have today will not be solutions, I don't think, a decade from now.
Yeah, absolutely. This constant evolution, this evolutionary pressure affects coaches tremendously. Not only, if we think back to a few years ago, the Ravens were lauded as the most analytically forward on fourth down decisions specifically, most analytically forward organization. And this year, they're still near the top, but the field is crowded now in a way that in 2019 it absolutely wasn't. John Harbaugh was going for many fourth downs that no coaches would even consider, and now you have coaches like Nick Sirianni and like Brandon Staley who are going for it on fourth down consistently, and even coaches who previously didn't go for it very often on fourth down, like Pete Carroll, going for it more often. And so that is a really interesting trend to watch as the league evolves. And I think we're at a point now where coaches recognize that, hey, these trends are real. It's not just a couple of nerds with their pocket protectors telling you how to play ball, that there are real implications to not going on fourth down, and we see those rates increase. And to Eric's point, if you are facing a team that is willing to run for it on 3rd and 7, your defense's assumptions change tremendously. How many linebackers 10 years ago would bite on play action on 3rd and long? Almost none. In fact, you would get chewed out for it. But now if you're facing the Philadelphia Eagles or you're facing the Baltimore Ravens, biting on 3rd and 7 on play action is a completely legitimate thing for the linebacker to do, because you know that that team is willing to go for it on 4th and short, especially from midfield and beyond.
Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about where win probability works in these public models and where it has some troubles. And this isn't a pick on Ben. Ben is a good friend of both of ours, and in fact, I helped Ben in the creation of these models years ago, just talking through different modeling assumptions. And there's only so much you can do with public data, et cetera. In general, win probability and things in these public models are very well calibrated, and there's a couple reasons for that. There's a lot of people working on them, so you have multiple sets of eyes that can go in and say, hey, the model's acting weirdly in this particular portion. People can train their own models. In fact, I retrained this model on this laptop in about 20 minutes. That's something that if you have a sufficiently strong laptop, you can do in a reasonable amount of time. And that's not something that we could have done before. But in general, again, pretty darn well calibrated. We don't see a whole lot of patterns in the residuals that should concern us until we get to the end of the game. And where we see is on 4th down decision making in the last 2 minutes is extremely low sample size. We see a lot of divergence away from expected versus reality, and win percentage swings as much as 25 to 50%. And this is something that, for the NFL FastStar model that Ben has been very forthright about. The model does have limitations in these end of games because they're so low sample. If we can only train on win probability for a 4th down decision with 2 minutes or less remaining, we may only get 3 of those looks per season. And that becomes extremely hard to model using a lot of traditional methods. Now, there was a great paper here at Sloan, so if you all haven't checked it out yet, over in the first hallway, about using a Bayesian approach to estimate 4th down success. And so that was an interesting approach there and corrects for some of these issues. But in general, football being a low sample size sport means that we have to be a little bit creative on how we correct for some of these low sample size issues. And one of the things that we wanted to propose, not just with 4th down decisions, but in general for a lot of these things having to do with success rates. For those of you who aren't familiar, Daniel Robinson, or D-Rob as he's known in the analytics community, published an article in 2019 on Variance Explained that talked about using empirical Bayes to estimate baseball data. Well, here we can use it for 4th down success rate. So we take a beta distribution and we fit that beta distribution to 4th down outcomes. And why would we do this? If we're early in a season and you are a member of a team that's only gone for a couple of 4th downs, a handful of them in week 4, your coach may ask you, well, what's our true probability of making this 4th down, this 4th and 1? What's our success rate? Well, if you're 2 for 2 on those 4th down tries, I would posit you don't want to tell your coach that you're 100%, that you're the best 4th down team in the league. That might seem a bit obvious, but I think we all kind of internalize where I'm going here. We have to have a way for correcting for these low samples. And so what we do is we create a distribution that mimics what previous seasons' 4th down success rates look like, and then we can take these low samples and regress them back to that distribution and then say, okay, well, we were 2 for 2, but we only have 2 samples, so we're very likely much more close to average than we are close to 100%. And this idea is something that is used to correct for all sorts of low sample issues throughout the NFL. You can do the same thing for running success rates, passing success rates. Running success rates by run type is another interesting example. How good are we at running power versus a certain defensive front? Well, we've only done it 5 times this year. I have no idea. Well, we can estimate that in a way that's relatively fast. Not to pick on our Bayesian friends, and especially our good friend Paul Sabin here in the front. But you know, I often joke with my friends who love Bayes that I don't have all day to answer the question. Sometimes I have to answer more than one question in a single day. And so this lets us very quickly estimate things without using things like you know, Monte Carlo simulation. And so it's a very quick and dirty answer. And then maybe in the off season, you can go back and build a more complete model and look at these things.
Yeah, so I mean, and that gets us, so, you know, that's the first problem, right? The first problem is to even just properly handicap what both teams have done, right? So in a game where, you know, I think about, you know, there have been many games where you watch your favorite team and they completely outplay the other team and yet they lose. And so, you know, you're trying to decide, well, what kind of information do I take from this game if I'm like gonna play fantasy football or I'm gonna gamble on the next game or something like that. You know, being able to actually assign that stuff to each team is, you know, the problem that we just talked about and all of those, you know, issues therein. But then there's the issue of, and this gets to what we're trying to do at SumerSports, is to assign that credit to all of the players. You don't get to, and we talked about this actually with John, you know, right before the talk, you don't get to like just have your team together all the time. You have to make decisions. There are trade-offs between, you know, for example, if you drafted two really great wide receivers and a great quarterback in 2 drafts, and they all three come up for contracts in a span of 2 to 3 years, you probably, hypothetically speaking, you have to decide whether or not to keep, you know, which 2 of them, right? Which one of them, and if your cap space isn't particularly high, and so you're under this optimization regime. And the problem is you know, how you assign that credit is going to change, you know, how you end up paying these players because they don't get paid collectively either. They get paid individually. And so, you know, oftentimes, and this is a thing that we all, I think, fall prey to. You look at Twitter, a lot of the great insights about passing games are oftentimes assigned to the quarterback. You look at EPA graphs, and Patrick Mahomes is always up in the right-hand corner where he belongs, frankly. But how much of that is Andy Reid? How much of that is the offensive line or wide receivers for Kansas City? How much of that is the fact that he plays in a division where 2 of the teams are West Coast teams and they're playing at 10 a.m. their time when they come to Kansas City? Like, how much of those things do we have to take into account? And, you know, you have to be able to, you know, assign credit and blame for all 22 players in a way that is robust and in a way that is actually capturing who they are as players. And this is a classic example here. So we tweeted out, and if you are on Twitter, let's get some Twitter followers today, Sean, at SumerSports on Twitter. We tweeted out this graphic where we're looking at the major throws, basically passes that have less than a 50% chance of completion per the NFL Fast Stars expected completion percentage model, which is the engine that builds CPOE, which is another attempt at trying to divide credit between the quarterback and everybody else. And you look at Josh Allen, Joe Burrow, Patrick Mahomes, Geno Smith, Kirk Cousins, Justin Herbert are all league leaders in a number of those completions. And, you know, bless him, Antonio Jones goes, this should be a wide receiver stat. I think, okay, I look at this and I think, okay, Josh Allen has 1 good wide receiver. The Bengals have 2 good wide receivers. Patrick Mahomes, last season, his team traded their best wide receiver to the Dolphins, a guy that almost got 2,000 yards receiving.
Kelsey counts.
Kelsey counts, he does. But is it and so the question is this a wide receiver stat or not? And the answer is you need like statistical machinery to answer that question. And that, you know, that is this, you know, certain next frontier of what we're working with here. And many people have made strides there. We at PFF, when I was there, we created PFF War, which divvied up the credit using their grading system. Paul Sabin, our friend and colleague in the front, he had ESPN's Plus Minus when he was there. Ron Yurko had NFL War, which did it for receivers, running backs, and wide receivers. But this is a problem that still, I think, is vexing for many of us in this industry because it tailors, you know, it comes into the next great frontier, which is roster building. Absolutely,
and one of the key pieces of advice we give to people, you know, when they're first starting out in football analytics, like, wow, it's like these things are really hard. And we're like, yes, they are. I'm sorry, it doesn't get easier. And once you solve this, like the problems get harder from then on. And even when you solve, quote unquote, solve the credit problem, it may only solve it partially, or there may be blind spots to certain positions. And so now you have to solve the problem multiple ways and then ensemble them together. There's no easy way to do this. And even some extremely complex modeling, using tracking data has been used to look at this problem. And I would say right now there's no one panacea. There's no one model that gets it 100% right. Even when you start mixing in frankly, scouting data, even with that.
Yeah, especially in the passing game. I mean, the running game there are fewer degrees of freedom, but the passing game is a much more difficult problem. And we live in a very small sample size sport. One of the things about this talk that hopefully it rises up is the fact that for a long time we had 16 games per team. We had 16 games per player season. Adding in play-by-play data multiplies all of that by 50 to 70 per player, right? So you're increasing the sample size there, but even then, most players, starting players are playing 1,000 snaps a year, which isn't that much. You add to that tracking data, which multiplies that by 25 frames per or 10 frames per second. So you add that to that significantly, but it's still an incredibly difficult problem for us, given that we've only had tracking data at the NFL level since 2017, and at the college level, only the last few years, and of varying quality.
Right, yeah, and especially even within the NFL, I would say the tracking data for this current year is almost unrecognizably better than the tracking data of 2018, which was very incomplete. We had certain stadiums that didn't work for the entire game. You'd lose the ball. You'd have players that would ghost onto the field. So the data we have is getting progressively better, but when a coach comes and asks you like, well, how does this compare to historical trends for the last 10 years? Like, I've got 3 years of usable data. That's a great question. I don't know how to help you. And so that's just one of the challenges in working with football. And even when we can instruct very good models using NGS, and so this one was created by Amazon for the league office. You'll see it on broadcasts a lot. It's the NGS version of completion percentage, and from there they build completion percentage over expectation. Who gets credit? Is this a wide receiver stat or a quarterback stat? Is it both? Is it a quarterback-wide receiver pairing stat? Those are questions we should be asking ourselves, because when we put these things in articles or when we talk about them publicly as statisticians, we are influencing perception of these players in some way, but we also just want to get the right answer. And so, I would ask the audience here, like, do we have any intuition on if this is a quarterback stat or a wide receiver stat or a bit of both? Yeah, so you could see how it varies between quarterback and receiver pairings within the same team. That's a really good first start. Of course, in the example here, he's a bit highlighted in green, so hard to make out. But we do have Lockett here catching a pass from, I believe, Russell Wilson, and that pair.
Back when he can complete a pass.
Wow.
Sorry.
Please ignore the Chiefs fan to my left. So. For many years, Lockett and Wilson were at the top of the leaderboard for this particular stat. And so then it says, okay, well, maybe this is a pairing stat. Maybe Lockett is uniquely suited at catching deep balls with a high angle, and Wilson's uniquely suited at throwing them. I think that's a perfectly fine supposition to have. Does anybody else have any alternative theories? Okay, that's fine. So I would agree. I think this is a stat that conflates several things. Quarterback skill is obviously one of them because it has to do with ball placement. The ability of the wide receiver not only to be open at the point of the throw, but to stay open throughout the entire trajectory, adjust to the ball. But it really is a coaching stat as well. The decisions that the quarterback makes are a function of who's open and a function of who they're told to throw to within the process of their reads. And some quarterbacks are instructed to throw higher variance throws in certain game situations. And so you see receivers that get targeted more when the game is on the line on higher risk throws with smaller windows. And so this conflates all three of these aspects in a way where, maybe we shouldn't just be saying, oh, well, Russell Wilson's at the top of the CPOE data board according to NGS, best quarterback in the league. It's not as simple as that. And I hate that we keep standing up here and saying like, sorry, it's complex, but it is.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you make a residual analysis like CPOE or rush yards over expected, which I know is a model that was a winner of the Big Data Bowl in 2019, I believe, you have to ask yourself, if you're trying to untangle exogenous things from a player evaluation, are they truly exogenous, and are they guaranteed to be so over the course of the next few years, right? The league evolves, the rules change. At some point, you might end up with a situation where the player affects the expectation space that they're living in.
And there's great examples of this all across different models that have won awards for the Big Data Bowl that have been put into production by the league. For quarterback decision-making models in his first year, Mahomes was one of the worst quarterbacks in the league. Well, was he really bad, or did he just have the talent to be able to make tight window throws? And so that's where we have to be really careful and specify what are we actually measuring. And that's something that we want to instill in this next generation of analysts, to be very particular about what questions you're answering. Because myself included, I was very fast and loose with the conclusions that I was drawing when I first started out using expected points and NGS models. But there's a lot that we have to account for.
Yeah, and again, like these, I mean, ultimately the big thing is constantly examine your results, constantly examine how your results change in time. I mean, I think the biggest thing about football and what makes it exciting, for everybody in the room, but for us working in it, it's that I don't think, I think the moral of the story, it's never going to be solved, right? You think about even baseball, which is in theory the most solved sport out there. They just made a bunch of rule changes, right? So how does that change the landscape of how the game works and how our expectations are built? Can you use anything from the past? Can you use some of it? I think for player evaluation, it's even more of a tricky thing, because these models become increasingly more complex. You add increasingly more features to it. Was there an RPO? RPOs weren't even something that Pro Football Focus tracked until 2017, right? So you had, their data set, 2/3 of their data set doesn't even have that in there. You continue with things like different play actions. Play action has gone up, to Sean's point, on 3rd and 7. It's gone from something like 10 to 15% in the NFL to something that a lot of teams run 25 to 35% now. How does that change the landscape of how you evaluate quarterback play? And that can give you errors if you're not willing to challenge your assumptions, and that can give you really big mistakes, which is what we're going to talk about with respect to Sumer. It can make you can get really big mistakes if you're allocating credit incorrectly to players that you're acquiring.
The good news for people like us and for other vendors like PFF is that football's non-stationary, and so it's never truly solved. And that's good news for a couple of reasons. Personally, I think solving these problems is a very entertaining way to pass time. Otherwise, I wouldn't go and get paid to do it. But it's entertaining for fans as well, because there's not just one way to win in the NFL. And I think as teams get better at player evaluation and get better at using tracking data and actually doing this credit problem, that we're going to see more and more different ways of constructing rosters and using scheme uniqueness to win in a league that only has one Patrick Mahomes. If you are working for a team or consulting with a team and they're looking for a quarterback, let's say it's the Texans in this year's draft at number 2, telling them, well, simply go find a Mahomes in the draft is not a very compelling answer. So we need to be able to dig more deeply so that we actually can answer these questions in a way that makes sense and is actionable.
Yeah, and so that takes us to where our company, SumerSports, and Jack Jones, our CEO, did a wonderful job yesterday, sort of giving the introduction into why and the how and the where we're going in the future. But ultimately, we're building on the shoulders of giants here when it comes to being able to take play-by-play data, have a robust idea of what credit is, trying to assign that credit to players, Obviously, cost is sort of a different variable, and put all of those things together and create optimal rosters for hopefully our eventual clients. And again, all of this, when you think about making multiple decisions at once from the bottom up, errors on the bottom propagate through and they multiply more quickly than they would in a top-down situation, and the top-down situation being largely the way in which a lot of these teams operate today. And so, this talk, goes through a lot of, pays homage to a lot of the great work that has been done in the past, but that great work was essential, and being able to build off of that in a robust way is incredibly important. If you're interested at all in this particular slide, we do have a website, SumerSports.com, if you guys are interested.
Yeah, and to expand on what Eric just said, if we get the credit problem right and you can truly evaluate players at the individual level, now something that we call roster value becomes possible. Because we're not looking, you don't look to maximize your left tackle. You don't look to maximize your quarterback specifically. You look to maximize your entire roster. But how do you assign a value to your entire roster if you can't value all the subcomponents and value the interactions of those subcomponents? Account for weak link systems like the coverage unit or the offensive line. And so that becomes the next step in this type of analysis. Divide out the credit and then look for those nonlinear interactions where a team becomes more than the sum of their parts. Or in some cases, teams bring in all-stars. I think one of the most unfortunate moves that we do see in football nearly every offseason is there is a team that has poor coverage play, and so they go out and they spend for an expensive corner. And the next year, absolutely nothing changes. Well, why is that? Well, coverage is only as strong as your weakest corner, right? In the same way that your offensive line is only as strong as your weakest lineman. But how weak do we know a corner is on a good team? Well, that's a credit problem, and that credit problem is exceedingly difficult.
Yeah, and again, it gets down to defining success in a small sample game. You have to be able to contextualize the historical ways in which we've talked about things like yards and touchdowns to evaluate players and coaches, assign credit, and build rosters, and that again is why we care, and why as we continue to see new data, right? You've probably gone to a bunch of data vendors today in every kind of sport, and all of those new data sources need to be with the aim of being able to help us evaluate what is happening on the field, and in most cases, it's all about what the players are doing on the field. So that is football is the lowest of the low sample games, and you need to be able to have the robust statistical techniques to do that. So we're going to take some questions now, but this is our contact information. If you want to contact Sumer directly, it's info@sumersports.com, and then this is myself and Sean's emails. We did not get the first name only treatment, which is fine. We have so many duplicate first names in our company that we have that. But so willing to open up for questions. Yep.
Yes, sir. No, I'll just repeat out what you. Yeah.
You're talking about fourth down, small sample sizes.
Mm-hmm.
There, rather than just doing an empirical-based regression to could you layer in other bits of information which could be predictive as well there? And what are some examples of things?
Yeah, so there's been some things attempted. He was asking about fourth downs instead of just regressing to an empirical base. Could you fold in other information? One of the very first attempts, and I believe it was Mike Lopez who did this, who's the director of analytics for the NFL, is he used third downs as a proxy for fourth downs. But the problem was after we looked at fourth down decision making after a sufficient amount of time, defenses don't play third and short the same way they play fourth and short. And so that proxy becomes bias. And we see that a lot in the NFL. But we also see that in how teams are treating fourth downs now. A lot of times the success rates for teams that are going for it on fourth down tend to be biased on the high side because the best offensive teams are going for it on fourth down. And so we need to correct for that as well.
Yeah, additionally, one approach that has been, that we did when we were at PFF, but also I think others have done, it's just computationally intensive as a simulation. Right. I mean, the ultimate thing is what Sean said is true. Like, teams play fourth downs differently. So, a traditional kind of top-down model on like using some XG boost type of framework is going to use something like point spread. It's going to use total to specify the differences between teams. But we know that, for example, if you're the Ravens, you're going to run 13 personnel more, which means you're going to face this kind of front more. You're going to face this many men in the box, and if the changes that manifest themselves on third down versus fourth down, they're probably going to be embedded in all of those features that would be in a simulation, right? And again, the issue with simulation is they're computationally tough, and to do a really good job, you have to have so many components, and you have to do a really good job with every single one of those components. So you have to specify, for example, what the likelihood of each kind of formation type, what's the likelihood of each kind of run concept type, what's the likelihood of each kind of ball carrier type and ball carrier decision, does he give it, does he keep it, all of that, and then of course the defensive side of the ball, which also has its issues. But that would be, that has been another way that's been proposed, because not only does it deal with the play-by-play efficiency, but also the pace. So some teams might be very, very good at milking the clock, very, very good at timeout avoidance and things like that, and that's something that we've worked on at Sumer. Other teams might not handle those situations as well, and if you just take, like these models, do the median time elapse, that might be also one of the the biases that creeps in. What we got?
Have you seen that some of the interaction effects between receiver and quarterback are non-stationary within a season? Like I couldn't imagine a new receiver-quarterback combo being off the same page at the beginning of the season and taking a few games to really material.
Good question.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of quarterback to wide receiver play has to do with understanding each other, and there are also, I would say, there's a fair amount of wide receivers that thrive off of their understanding of the quarterback rather than necessarily running routes crisply or athletic ability, but they just have a good understanding of where their quarterback is going to look when they're in trouble. And that's absolutely a skill that develops over time. I think that's one of the reasons why you see quarterbacks, especially higher end quarterbacks, will have a preference for receivers they played with a long time that maybe have lost a step or two, but that receiver understands where they're going to want to throw the ball when they're on the run. I think Aaron Rodgers is a great example of that, who has come to his team and asked for certain players to get signed who he has that relationship with.
We'll see how Aaron
exactly
Rodgers' preferences stand up over time, but yeah.
Well, that's a different matter. That'll be our other talk.
Next question? Yeah, in the front.
Do you foresee computer vision being joined with player tracking data to get closer to assigning the credit, like even quarterbacks like ball placement or other things?
Yeah. So computer vision is right now used by many to obtain tracking data on the college side and then to corroborate it on the NFL side, because the NFL has RFID chips in the shoulder pads, so that's how they generate it, and it's standardized for the whole league. College football has certain standards across conferences, but not the whole not the whole NCAA, FBS, FCS type thing. So computer vision has been used to get tracking data, but then I do think in the future there will be what's called pose estimation, which is basically like the limbs and how those things move around. That is just, I think, becoming available in the NBA. It's been in MLB for a while. It's not made its way to football completely yet, but I mean, the thing about baseball, if anything baseball has shown us, it's that once you get done with all the easy problems, then you have to collect data and solve harder problems, and I think football will be no different. I don't know how how long that's going to take, because I do think that we still haven't, as Sean said, a really tight solution to tracking data, assigning credit to players yet. But once we as a community get there, that'll probably be the next step.
I just hope that by the time the problems are sufficiently hard that I'll be retired. In the back? Yeah, so the question had to do with assigning values to defensive players in the same way you do on offensive players. Yes, there have been attempts with varying degrees of success with that. One of the difficult things about the defense is a lot of times when you're doing your job right, you're not in the play at all. A great example of this is free safeties. Free safeties will erase entire sections of the field. I mean, that means the ball never comes to that section of the field. The wide receivers will run option routes and avoid that section of the field if the free safety is there in the first place. So how do you measure that? That's a very difficult problem, and honestly one that I think takes a combination of tracking data algorithms and human expertise to combine together to answer. Maybe we'll eventually get to a tracking data only solution, but I think for now you have to meld man and machine together to get at a sufficient answer to that. Otherwise, you'll have examples of safeties where they only get thrown out a few times a season, and it's like, well, okay, well, were they impactful or were they not impactful? That's, I think scouts and coaches will say, well, he did his job. He erased the entire, middle of the field. Of course he had an impact, but the onus is on us to quantify that in a real way. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
I can relate, so I apologize if you already discussed this, but when you are talking about a player credit system, do you factor in the player's health, longevity, where they are in their career? If so, or if not, how do you see that being used by teams in order to avoid being a short-sighted roster building?
Yeah, I think when you take into account longevity, age curves, injury history, all of these things, that's much less on the credit for an individual play, but certainly in the projection for future performance, of which current play is an input. So teams absolutely take that into account now. Different positions age at different rates, so those survival curves look radically different from running back to wide receiver to quarterback, for instance. And of course now, Tom Brady, we can remove him from the quarterback data set and he can quit messing up all of our aging curves. But these things are taken into account, and same with injury history. But injury is a thorny problem. Not all injuries are created equal, and it's an extremely hard thing to predict. I think for teams where you have a player with a history of concussions, I think there you have a valid concern that this player is probably going to get more concussions, and so now that's an additional injury risk. But for if a player, for example, we talked about Lockett earlier, he broke his leg on a pass. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to break his leg again. So these injuries have to be categorized correctly and accounted for.
Gentleman in front.
So you guys said earlier that if your team ranks like the bottom in pass coverage and then you have like a top corner, you're not going to see that move the needle as much. So I guess could you argue that like an elite corner would have more value on a team that's already stronger against the pass?
Yeah, I think that is probably fair. Obviously what that does is it pushes player N to player N+1 in the list, right? So then that by definition would make the fifth defensive back on the team better. But yeah, that's a good point. Now the issue, of course, is like if you have a good team and you have cap space to do that, then what's going on there, right? If you have a great defense and you have cap space, you should probably be spending it on offense, and so is that a good investment or not? It probably is a better investment, but it was funny. I was talking to somebody from the NBA the other day, and it's like it was really a good discussion of like, at some point it doesn't matter how good the player is. It's like the cost, right? The cost is almost entirely because there's so much variance in player performance that the cost really is the question. So I would almost have that the thought process: if you're buying elite play at corner, what are you doing that at the expense of? And if it's to make a decent defense better, maybe that there are other places on the roster to allocate funds. Yeah, go ahead.
Just follow that up then. I guess really, who is benefiting from being that elite corner?
You're saying who is benefiting from being why should elite corners exist or like?
I mean, essentially, it's like if you're
Yeah.
If you have great pass coverage, you're not going to need that corner. But then if you have bad pass coverage, it's not what you want.
Yeah, I would say for one, coverage ability is so variable that I'm skeptical of this idea that somebody can be an elite player for a significant amount of time. But one place where they can, I think about you look at Los Angeles Rams with Jalen Ramsey. It's like those players can be, when you think about I think of like the secondary like a basketball team where you have 5 guys and they all have to fit roles, and like the left corner for some teams, much like a center for some basketball teams, they don't always fit the traditional center role, but they all have to fit a certain set of roles. And so if you have a guy like Jalen Ramsey who can play 3 or 4 positions really well, then the other 4 players in your secondary don't necessarily get put in situations where they're at their worst. And then so that increases. So, and this isn't completely perfect, but if you have a set of probabilities that are bounded, you maximize the product of the probabilities, which is basically just like the likelihood that they don't all screw up, or 1 minus the fact they all screw up. It's maximized when everybody has the same probability, right? So the value that a great corner has is in playing such a difficult assignment that he has a same probability of performing that assignment well as the worst player on your team performing the easiest assignment well.
And that really opens up scheme for your coaches, right? So now you don't necessarily have to be all in zone coverage. You can mix in man coverage, and so that gives the coaches much more flexibility in how they design their defense. Did you want to pick?
Yeah, just how much time do we have?
Yeah, we've got 10 more minutes.
We could take a few more.
And the white sweatshirt back there.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned that sort of caught my attention was that football is sort of the smallest sample size sport we have. If we did have more data, if this was the NBA and you had 82 games each season, what are a couple of areas you think would yield interesting research? So, just a couple examples. My dad thinks it'd be really interesting to track like how many wide receivers are, like how many pass interferences a wide receiver's drawing, like
Yeah.
a defensive line, and how many holding calls, something like that.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things on the tracking data side, if you had many more games, is that there are entire classes of models that just run better. So a lot of transformer-based models require a significant amount of data to train on. So if we had 80 football games per season, I think we would see those models converge.
The Jimmy Butler meme, though. The
Right.
guy's leaning over the.
Right.
Maybe
Yeah.
really tired, but yeah.
I think our data center might catch on fire, but we'd actually be able to train the models, which would be really interesting. And so then some of that insight becomes much more readily apparent.
I think secondary play is the other answer. Like if you think about safeties, some safety, depending upon if you're a deep safety in the NFL, you probably are involved in like 4 or 5 plays a game, and so. And that was an issue. So you asked a question about defensive players. Like if you go, I wrote a paper in Sloan in 2020 about wins above replacement using charting data, scouting data, and stuff like that. And the biggest issue that I had was safeties, because you had a safety that had 2 or 3 huge plays a year, and they would like kind of gobble up a lot of the credit on a defense, when in reality the scouting grades are kind of missing some of the intricacies as to why the play happened the way it did. I think you would just get more robust estimates of how coverage players did, because coverage, and all defensive metrics in a lot of ways are just a reversal of strength of schedule. And then from there, you would just play obviously more of the space of teams. So you get a more robust estimate of who the player is. And then, and you would the sample size would be kind of equivalent also of like, linemen who get, frankly, a decent amount of reps per year one-on-one with other linemen.
Absolutely.
Question down there?
Yeah, on the division of credit problem, obviously it seems like one of the biggest problems in terms of sort of moving from counting stats to more individual, sort of isolated player statistics. I mean, maybe I'm coming at this from too sort of purely experimental an angle, but like a traditional like medical randomized control trial, for instance, you have a control group.
Yeah.
And then you have treatments that are applied to perhaps different, several different groups. And I mean, it seems to me that there's a similar paradigm here where, each action that we're performing during a certain play is basically a treatment that's being applied to each of the different potential players, and it's resulting in some sort of outcome. And so what we really need is like some sort of control group.
We need a coach to just basically A/B test the NFL, right? I mean, that would be amazing.
I mean, so it's basically like about creating that counterfactual, right, that we can use in the control group. And I mean, at least to me, it seems like simulation, sort of that's like the direction that we're heading.
Yeah.
Creating this counterfactual. Obviously, you already alluded to all the problems that come with trying to
Right. Enough experiments in enough amount of time. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, like, what other possible avenues do we have to sort of try to create that control group, whether it's for lack of better, hardware that's immediately available, or just lack of knowledge of, like, we're not able to get inside players' brains to model how they're going to react to the other players'
Right.
reaction.
Well, and not only that, but there's also there's the bias associated with like teams only ask players things that the good teams only ask players things that they think that they can do well, right? So you don't even have it's biased even more than you think, right? Because they're not only not traversing the whole space of possible plays, but possible assignments too. And so that would be obviously cool. I think we're a ways away from that, but basically asking, if you ask Jared Goff to be Patrick Mahomes for a day, no play action plays, no, only passes to the sideline, move on the run type of stuff, he probably would struggle. Like that's my guess. But if you were the coach of the Detroit Lions, you would never do that because you're trying to win football games. And so, and teams are at various degrees of that. I think that that's a cool problem, is to say which coach is truly trying to hit all the easy buttons for their players, and which coaches are kind of, there have been examples, like a new coach with an old roster is probably just going to run their scheme and kind of expose their players a little bit so that they can move on with the roster later. Finding that out in a statistical way would be kind of cool, because then you would get some of the counterfactuals.
Have you or any other agency or group that you know of ever done any kind of research to quantify the value added of applied analytics in the current NFL? I think we all know that analytics offers an optimization opportunity, but there are plenty of scouts and coaches out there that would argue that their
Yeah.
experiences are irreplaceable. Do you know of anyone that's quantified the value of adding analytics over trusted experience?
I think the teams are far too. The teams that do a lot of analytics don't want people to know, and so there's a little bit of that. I think that there are ways around it. We talked about in this talk the SumerSports.com. If you want to go and look at our in-game decision model for coaches, there's some and so Nick again, the question is how much is Nick Sirianni going for fourth downs more because his analytics staff, and how much is he just doing it because his quarterback's really good at quarterback sneaks, or he's a vibes guy and he loves going for fourth downs. But like that we estimated just that at being about 0.8 of a win, which 0.8 of a win, if you think about a $220 million salary cap, it's a significant amount. And I would say that would be just scratching the surface on what it is. But again, most of analytics, I think people who are skeptical of analytics are going to attribute to what they're doing, scouting, coaching, all this stuff, things that we would also attribute to analytics, like game planning and stuff like that, using evidence-based analysis to run play action more, to motion more, all that stuff. So it's another division of credit problem, frankly. And I would say that there's nothing that's being applied in the NFL that's purely analytics. So to assign a credit to that would be, I think, hard. But just given how the league has evolved, as we said before, like 2016, 0 of the teams went for fourth downs that they should have gone for more than 50% of the time, and now more than half the teams do. That's a value add, right? And I don't know how big that is, or whether or not they've gotten worse at fourth downs because of that, because with volume, efficiency goes down, type of thing. But I think it's I would bet a significant amount of money it's positive, but I don't know how positive right now.
And I do think there is something interesting happening in the public discourse with teams. There's a strong incentive for decision makers and coaches to lie about their use of analytics, because it becomes just one more piece of their planning process, and teams don't want to expose any part of their planning process to, certainly not the public eye, but definitely not their opposing teams. So that would be extremely hard to measure. I would love to know the answer, though. If you figure it out, that's my email.
So I think we have one more. Yep.
Yeah, is there any thought about, because there's a lack of training data at times for Cardinals capture you were showing earlier,
Mm-hmm.
turn back to that slide. Yeah, if we're trying to measure one's livelihood or credit assigned to that receiver making that catch,
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't it make sense to ask an organization like that to simulate a play like this to ultimately get to this point, and then get to that point where you can predict one
Yeah.
Yeah, what you're asking was actually the subject of one of the big data bowl entries from, I want to say
2018.
Was it 2018?
Yeah.
Yeah, where they basically froze these plays in time and then looked at what if all these different things happened in the future, and the subject of it was quarterback decision making rather than this particular model. But that approach has been tried. There's just a lot of confounders. One of the things we mentioned earlier was, when you did that decision-making analysis, that Patrick Mahomes actually came out looking rather poorly in it, which was very interesting. And so it leads you not to a complete answer, but it kind of brings forth a new set of questions. Like, okay, well, if he's a bad decision-maker, why is he still making all of these throws? And that was particularly vexing for me when I was working for the Ravens, because it's like, oh, look, Patrick Mahomes is a bad decision maker, quote unquote, and we're still losing to him. So that just opens up a new set of questions like, okay, well then what do we do about our defense? How do we adjust? How do we play differently if we're already forcing him into these situations in which he's throwing into tight windows and far downfield? We've already kind of put him in the worst situation, and he's still making good plays. That's just an unfortunate reality you run into sometimes. I think we're out of time.
That's it. Thanks for having us.
Well, yeah, thanks for having us, and appreciate your questions.